Okay, happy Tuesday, everybody. This is Scott Burris. Pleased to be here to introduce Dr. Stephanie Hartberg, who's going to be talking with us about predicting customer behavior. Just as a reminder, please place your Zoom on mute or your phone on mute if you're using phone audio, and feel free to post questions in the chat box. We'll be reviewing those questions throughout the presentation and have some time at the end for question and answer. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Scott, and good morning, everybody. I just want to say that it is a pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate being invited. I hope that my presentation is interesting for you. I thought my research was fascinating, and I'm excited to share it with you. Now, the title of my presentation today is Predicting Customer Behavior: How One Model of Engagement Could Impact Retail Performance Outcomes. So today what I'm going to do is first identify the problem that I'll be discussing. I'm going to give you an overview of the research that I conducted. And my particular study was a qual study using the grounded theory method. I'm going to talk a little bit about my results and the development of a model that I generated. I'm going to talk about the importance of the model that I generated. And probably most importantly, I'm going to talk about the additional potential of the model and some of the benefits of using the model that my study generated. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I want to talk today about the unprecedented number of retail stores that are closing or going out of business. I think this picture is a familiar sight for most of us. I don't think any of us have missed the fact that a number of retail stores are going out of business, and retail is in jeopardy. Now, this is close to my heart because long before I pursued academics, I had a career in retail, and it was something that I was fascinated by, but I knew that things weren't going the way that they should, even 20 years ago when I was still doing this. So as retail started to go downhill, I decided to go and explore exactly what is going on. Well, the retail problem has become so serious that there's even been a term coined for the destruction of retail, and it's been called the retail apocalypse. It's not a very flattering term, and what it's suggesting is that retail is dying a death that they'll never be able to recover from. To illustrate this, over 9,000 stores closed in just 2017 and 2018 alone, and another 1,800 stores are predicted to close in 2019. Now you might be thinking, retail, what do I care? Well, retail does matter to all of us because if you're a customer, you probably shop in a retail store. When retail stores go under, the result for you as a customer is higher prices, bad customer service, and fewer products to choose from. So my question was, what happened to retail? Industry experts have indicated that the biggest problem with the biggest problem with retail is low employee engagement. The problem with low employee engagement in retail is so serious that it was actually determined to be the retail industry's biggest failure in 2015, and it doesn't appear to be getting any better. When retail employees aren't engaged, the results for a retail store are decreased sales, increased employee turnover, and an increase in theft. And that theft can take place both internally from the employees and from customers. And I put an interesting statistic in here. The cost to hire and train a new employee is $3,400 on average. And if employees are quitting, imagine that every time a store has to hire somebody new, it's costing that organization $3,400. Given this, it's no wonder that retail is falling apart. What's even more unfortunate is that of all the workers in the United States, frontline retail workers are the least engaged. That's all workers, all industries. The most unengaged employees are frontline retail workers. This is pretty serious business because retail is the largest employment sector in America. And this really kind of shocked me when I saw this. Retail employs more people than any other industry in this country. That comes to about 42 million people in 2014, and more than half of those people employed in retail are frontline retail workers. So when we're talking about low employee engagement, we're talking about a lot of workers. Now, before I continue, I think it's important to define our terms of engagement. What are we talking about here? Employee engagement has actually been divided into 3 different categories. You've got your engaged employee, which is at the top. Engaged employees are the people who take initiative, they're enthusiastic, and they're committed to the organization. Then you've got your middle of the road employees. These are the not engaged employees. They're the people who meet minimum standards. They don't really care about the organization. They're not necessarily helping the organization, but they're not necessarily hurting it either. They're more or less the employees standing in the corner and taking up space. But then you've got your actively disengaged employee. These are the employees who are actively undermining the organization. They work against the organization through things like theft and not showing up. They hate their jobs and they're bad for morale, and they certainly aren't serving customers. Unfortunately, for frontline retail workers, the majority of them are in this category, the not engaged employee or the actively disengaged employee. Frontline retail workers are therefore simply meeting minimum standards. They don't care about the organization, and a majority of them are actually working against the organization. Again, it's not hard to see why retail is in bad shape. This is significant because the top reason a customer will choose one retailer over another is their frontline service. When an employee isn't engaged, customers are 25% less likely to make a purchase. And when customers encounter low employee engagement, they interpret that as low employee engagement as the retailer offering poor product or service. So even if the product itself is good or the actual service that's being offered is good, it won't be interpreted that way if the customer encounters really unengaged frontline workers. Okay, so my question was, how do you increase employee engagement among frontline retail workers? And this was the subject of my research study. To conduct my research, I composed a questionnaire that was composed of about 30 different questions that were open-ended, and I was trying to explore the factors that are most likely to elicit employee engagement behavior among frontline retail workers. And the results really surprised me. What I found is that there are a number of factors that could be clustered into 6 interdependent categories of engagement. When all 6 of these categories are addressed, theoretically, an employee is going to be engaged. And these 6 categories turned out to be leadership, customers, performance, relationships, influence, and compensation. Together, these categories formed the frontline retail worker employee engagement model. And you can see here that the different categories had different percentages of influence. What I found significant was that the category of leadership had the most impact on whether or not an employee was engaged. And the factors that I included in leadership were things such as good management, getting information, respect from the employer, and having responsibility, autonomy, and training. The next 2 important categories were customers and performance, which were almost the same in terms of their influence. Customers and performance included things such as good relationships with the customers and coworkers, getting information, good management, and also being able to get good feedback and recognition, knowing about the products and service that was being offered, and opportunities for advancement. The next most influential was the category of relationships, and this is the relationship of the employee to the coworker, to customers, to management, and to the organization. The second least most influential was influence. And influence included things like opportunities for advancement and training. And finally, compensation. It's interesting that compensation had the least impact on whether or not an employee would be engaged. And compensation included things such as good benefits, incentives, and wages. So what you could conclude from this model is that if you want an employee to engage, they're least likely to choose engagement behaviors if they're given money, but they're most likely to choose engagement behaviors if they have strong leadership with good training and respect. And in this slide, I summarize some of those variables that really will influence employee engagement among frontline retail workers. And again, you've got your strong leadership, good relationships, flexible schedules, time for family. And then you go down the list, and where at the bottom, opportunities for advancement and fair pay were probably the least influential, although they did impact engagement. The model was fascinating for me because it was results that I hadn't expected. And yet, after I developed it, I could see where the model was a viable instrument to first create employee engagement strategy. You can use the model to create employee engagement strategy by developing strategy based on the 6 different domains. Theoretically, if your strategy included and addressed all 6 domains and put the emphasis where each category was supposed to be identified as important, you could create an effective engagement strategy. The second surprise that I had was that you could use the model to measure employee engagement. So after a strategy has been implemented, theoretically, you could use this model to help you measure whether or not your strategy is working. You can look at the results and the behavior of your employees and see how it goes along with the domains in the model. If an employee isn't doing well, or you see that engagement is kind of down, you can first of all identify where the problem is, and second, you can use the model to help you identify how it's working. The way that I would see this working is that if you see an employee not engaging in employee engagement behaviors, you can go to the model and help identify where they're missing it, and then the employer can use that model to figure out which area they need to place more emphasis on. And that segues into the third part of this instrument, which is identifying the critical factors of engagement that are not getting met and applying corrective action. The model can actually be used to help identify specifically which area needs to be addressed. So theoretically, again, I really want to emphasize the theoretical part because this is a grounded theory study. Theoretically, employee engagement behavior can actually be predicted based on to the extent to which the factors in the model are being met. So in other words, you can actually possibly tell how an employee is going to engage just based on the extent to which they're meeting the different factors in the engagement model. Well, this got me thinking, and this was actually an extension of my research study, not the actual part of the study. After I completed my research, I got to thinking, is it possible that the model could also be used to predict customer behavior in addition to employee behavior? And my answer to that question did happen to be yes, I think it could. And here's why. It seems that customer needs may actually parallel the needs of frontline retail workers. And because they are so similar, retail leaders may be actually able to use the model to predict customer behavior, to leverage the model to induce desired customer behavior, such as buying more, and to be able to assess the organization for areas of engagement failure when customers are not exhibiting desired behavior. So in other words, if an employer, a retail leader is seeing that customers are not behaving in the desired fashion, like they're walking away without making purchases, they can actually use the model to assess where the customers are not getting their needs met, and then assess the organization about what area they're failing in order to eventually elicit the desired customer behavior. Now, just to illustrate this, I made a list of the potential needs that customers have, and then the engagement factor that my research study produced that corresponds with this. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them. That's a lot of data. But for example, customers need a well-managed store. Well, similarly, employees need strong leadership. Customers need good relationships and positive experiences with their frontline retail workers. Correspondingly, employees need a good relationship and positive experiences with their customers. So as you can see, the needs of customers really are very similar to the needs of frontline retail workers. So my theory is, if the model can be used to predict employee behavior, it could also predict customer behavior. This is how it could work. Employers could refer to the frontline retail worker engagement model and its 6 domains. Then they can conduct organizational analysis of employee engagement using the categories with each domain. And then they can identify areas of deficiency, which could facilitate reliable predictions of customer behavior. Now, here's an example. When an employer might identify that employees are poorly trained or uninformed, that would translate into potentially an increase in returns because customers are getting sold products that they don't want or need. Or the employees may not feel respected by store management. The corresponding customer behavior is customers will be shopping somewhere else. Or customers who are not getting a flexible schedule for their family and don't, or may call in sick when they're not getting that flexible schedule, will not show up for work. The store will then be short-staffed and customers' needs will not adequately be served. So the exciting part here is you can actually predict how customers are going to act just based on how engaged an employee is, and the model can be used to determine that. The model can also be used for problem solving. First, you could identify that there was a problem within the organization. In retail, that might translate into poor sales, bad reviews, customer complaints, or employee turnover. The employer can then turn to the model and its 6 domains and conduct organizational analytics by evaluating how the organization is doing using the categories assigned to each domain. To do the analytics, the employer might interview employees, observe employee and customer behavior. They might evaluate training and development procedure and invite feedback from their customers. After collecting all this data, the organization would be empowered to tweak their employee engagement in the problem areas to address the problem that was identified in the first step. And then they would actually achieve organizational improvement as the predictable outcome of increased employee engagement. And I really like that idea of being predictable, because right now an organization or an industry that is in trouble as retail can't rely on hopes and dreams. They need something that's reliable and predictable. So what are the benefits of being able to predict customer behavior? Well, first and foremost, employers would be able to increase control over customer spending behavior. This is really important because right now employers seem to be on a hope and a prayer, hoping that customers will come in and spend their dollar in their store. If they could actually leverage engagement, they could possibly also leverage customer behavior and elicit more of the behaviors that they want from their customers by eliciting desired behaviors in their employees, because the needs are fairly similar. Another way of benefiting from this is simply increased revenue. If customers are happy, customers are going to spend money. If customers are going to spend money, they're going to want to spend it with an organization that they feel is faithful to them and interested in serving them. This goes to my third point. That increases organizational and brand loyalty. When an organization has brand loyalty from their customers, customers are more receptive to organizational change. And for example, that might be price increases. Employers can also improve the hiring process using this model by recognizing potential employees who are likely to elicit and encourage desired customer behavior. So the model, again, can be used in the hiring process. When employers are screening employees, they can determine how well do they exhibit the behaviors or the potential behaviors that are needed in order to engage them. And technically, you can actually predict how the customer is going to respond to this employee just based on how well they seem to meet the basic engagement criteria in the hiring process. A final benefit would be overall improvement in organizational performance. The overall improvement can be attained by using the model to tap into customer needs and their emotional space. Shopping basically is a very emotional experience, and I think that that's what we really need to take into account when we're talking about engagement. There are certain needs, emotional needs and experiences that employees and customers need, and again, they're very, very similar. By using the model will give employers access to this emotional space and a means of tapping into them, and also of prioritizing which needs need to be addressed and which needs are maybe not so important. Once those needs have been tapped into and we've gained access into them, the employer has the power to leverage the information for organizational benefit. And I think it's really important that retail organizations have that power if we're going to save the industry. So that's really the crux of my study. I think it's important to emphasize that the retail situation is a very serious situation, and it needs to be addressed before the industry continues on the path that it's going. And I really believe that my research and my discovery of these different domains could make a difference. But I don't think we should limit it to simply trying to help employees engage. We also need to try to engage the customer. And when we gain that mutuality, I think that we will actually see a turnaround in the retail industry. I'm open for questions.
Great, Stephanie. Thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. And I think, I'll start off with a question. I don't see any questions in the chat. We can open them up here and have people post those as we're talking. But a question that comes to mind as I'm listening to your findings is, if you were to put yourself in a position of, consulting with an organization, say a retail chain or something like that, what would you do to go about assessing the situation so that you could come up with recommendations such that you have in this presentation, but that are directly aligned with a needs assessment you might conduct? And just curious what you kind of ran into as you were looking at the literature as far as some best practices for needs assessments with these type of organizations.
That's a really good question, because what I discovered in my research is that surveys do not work. So I would actually use some of the steps that I talked about just earlier in my presentation, and I would do employee interviews. I would actually do an observation of employee behavior. I would solicit customer feedback, and I would also want to get some feedback from the retail leaders. I don't think any one step is sufficient. I would need to do all of those things, and I would need to get kind of a global picture of where the organization is. But when I'm collecting the data, I would use my model to help guide my inquiry. And then as I collect this data, I would probably have to formulate it in such a way that I organize it based on the different factors in each category so that I can make sense out of it. Because again, it's a lot of qual data, and I would handle it very similarly to the way that I handled my study.
Okay, very good. Another question that we have here in the chat is, how applicable might this model be to organizations other than retail organizations? For example, could the model apply to service organizations? Why or why not?
I am so glad somebody asked that question. I believe this model is actually adaptable to any industry, not as is. I think that the basic structure is applicable, but I would want to conduct the same kind of study, the same kind of questionnaire to the different populations. And then I would want to generate different data based on the different population that we're trying to engage. So the basic structure would be the same, I think, but we would want to tailor it for every population. And I think we could develop a new model for every type of employee population.
Okay, great. Looks like one other question is, if you could talk maybe a little bit about the approach you took methodologically, and if you were to do it over again, would you do grounded study, or do you think there might be other methodologies you could apply to further understand this issue?
Well, the research format that I used was actually not my original choice. Dr. Sundstrom suggested I do grounded theory, and in hindsight, that was an outstanding method. I think that I would stay with grounded theory if I were to do it over again. Reason being is, after I started doing my research, I discovered that right now the real crux of the problem is that we don't even have a definition of employee engagement that anybody can agree on. And that's really where I started. So when you don't even have your basic terms defined, grounded theory is really your best option. So that's one of the reasons why I chose that. And in terms of developing the study, I had to start from scratch, just building a theory of employee engagement. And what I found is that the definition of employee engagement will change depending on the organization and the industry. So every time you're trying to come up with an employee engagement strategy, I think you're going to have to come up with a unique definition based on the specific industry. And in order to do that, you would need to, again, apply the grounded theory principles.